Hi, I'm Dr. Dave Clayton, and today we're going to talk about calcium supplementation. If you've been diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia and you're trying to improve your bone health and you're trying to build back that bone, you've probably heard the recommendation that you need to get 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day. And today we're going to look into whether that's the case, whether that's a great recommendation, and how you should be thinking about calcium supplements as you consider a comprehensive strategy of nutrition and fitness and supplementation to build that healthy bone. So whether you've been diagnosed with osteoporosis, whether you've been diagnosed with osteopenia, or whether you're just concerned about it because it runs in the family or you're getting older, this is a video for you. And let's put some of these questions to the test and see what the research shows. So let's start with this question of where does this 1,500 milligram of calcium daily, where does this recommendation come from? Well, it comes from studies done in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s when we looked at how much calcium does the body excrete every day, and then if we supplement calcium, how much do we need to take in order to offset those losses to get a positive calcium balance so that what we're taking in is more than what we're excreting. And the number that they centered on in the 70s was 1,500 milligrams of calcium daily. That was the number that gave you a net positive calcium balance. And the presumption was that that was enough to forestall bone loss, because if you're taking in more than you're excreting, it's got to be going somewhere and it must be going to bone, right? So we would think that we'd see a correlation then between calcium and bone health, bone density. And unfortunately, since the 70s, the studies haven't really borne that out. In fact, studies show, as we look at that data and we corroborate it with more modern studies, what we see is that it's really hard to change your calcium balance, and that calcium balance is really resistant to changes in dietary calcium, that you can have 400, 800, 1,500, 1,700 milligrams of calcium a day, and there's no reliable impact on your calcium balance. So the body's homeostatic mechanisms tend to thwart what we're doing with the calcium intake in the form of supplements. Which leads us to the next question of, does that calcium intake, if it maybe is affecting your calcium balance and we're not sure what that impact is, then does that translate into measurable changes in bone density? And can we extrapolate that to a lower risk of fractures or negative effects of the osteoporosis and bone loss? So the answer is probably not. There's very little evidence in the published research that additional calcium in the form of supplementation leads to measurable improvements in bone density. If we look at all of these studies, 14 studies that were published from the 80s to the 2000s, over 7,000 patients that we looked at, what we see is that there's essentially no impact. Out of all these trials, there was one that showed a positive correlation between calcium and bone density, one that showed a negative correlation, and the rest of them showed no difference. Doesn't matter how much calcium you take, bone density doesn't change. So overwhelmingly, as we look at the evidence, what we see is that this recommendation to get 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day is pretty dated. It goes back at least 50 years. And that as we try to test this theory by looking at, can we measurably impact the calcium balance through supplementation, the answer seems to be no. And then we look at bone density. Does taking these calcium supplements translate into measurable improvements in bone density? The answer still seems to be no. So this looks like one of these recommendations that was well-intended at some point and became part of the medical zeitgeist and how we look at, treating patients. However, as we build data and evidence, it's hard to support making this continued recommendation. So, where do we go now then? Well, let's look at some of the data to support this. So here's data on spine bone density on the left and hip bone density on the right. And if you've ever had a DEXA scan done, we're checking the spine and the hip pretty much every time. And in this case, what we see is that it doesn't matter how much calcium you take. In this study, the spinal bone density goes up a little bit, but it's pretty static across the board. And hips, we go down a little bit, but it's pretty steady across the board. You can see just by glancing at the bar graphs, there's not a whole lot of change as we change our calcium intake. So you might say, okay, I think that's a great idea, and the evidence looks good in favor of maybe I could stop the supplement, but I feel better when I take it. So let's look at some of the risks, because anytime we start taking something as a supplement or an additive, we run the risk of benefits and risks, right? So we saw that there's very little benefit in the published research. Let's look at what maybe the risks are. And what we see, interestingly, is that your risk of ending up in the hospital due to abdominal complaints, so whether it's nausea or vomiting or diarrhea or abdominal pain, doubles when you're taking this much calcium. And because we're adding so much calcium to the body, and we have just shown that it's probably not ending up in the bone, it's got to be ending up somewhere. And unfortunately, there's two places where it tends to end up. One is aggregating in the kidneys. So we see a much higher incidence of kidney stones, which nobody wants. And we see a marked increase in your risk of a heart attack, because we're ending up with that calcium coating the arteries, calcifying those arteries, and running that risk of a heart attack or a stroke. So there's actually some really good data out there showing that not only is there little benefit from taking excess calcium, but there may be some significant risks involved. So now the question you're asking is, what do I do, right? I mean, calcium seems to be an essential part of a diet, and I don't want to avoid it altogether. And the answer is, you should be getting it from your diet. If you're eating healthy, you should be getting plenty of calcium. Most of the studies suggest that 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day is the range that we should all be shooting for. We don't need to be supplementing to 1,500 or 2,000, because we don't know where all that calcium is going to go, and we don't want it to end up in the wrong places. However, 500 to 1,000 milligrams is a good range. And the good news is you can get that from diet. You don't need to take a supplement in order to get that amount of calcium. Now, we all know that dairy is a great place to get our calcium. So cheese and milk and yogurt and kefir and whatever dairy you want to use, you can definitely get plenty of calcium from dairy. So your typical kind of cup of yogurt, for example, or a cup of milk has 300-400 milligrams of calcium. So you're well on your way. It doesn't take much dairy to get the type of calcium intake that we're talking about from diet. And then nuts and vegetables, especially your dark green leafy vegetables, have a ton of calcium. So you're talking about your collard greens, your spinach, your kale. 1 cup of cooked greens can have anywhere from 100 to 200 milligrams of calcium per cup. And that's only with maybe 30, 40 calories. So it's very easy to get a lot of calcium from there. Also, your cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, a cup of cooked broccoli has also about 100 milligrams of calcium. And then nuts, a handful of nuts also has 100 milligrams of calcium. And bear in mind that meats also, fish, all these natural foods, a serving you can guesstimate has about 100 milligrams of calcium. So whether you're talking about broccoli or cauliflower or kale or salmon or chicken, you can assume, just for argument's sake, that 1 serving has about 100 milligrams of calcium. And if you add that up during the day, there's no way you're going to fall short of that 500 milligrams of calcium. You just got to stay away from the processed foods and the calorie beverages and the other filler foods that don't have that nutritional value, but you don't need me to tell you that. So in conclusion, I would say, if you're worried about your bone health, you definitely want to be thinking about calcium. It's an important part of building bone, but you don't need to get excited about taking a ton of calcium supplements. You should be thinking more about the exercise, about your vitamin D, your vitamin K2, and all of the things that you need to put together in order to give your bone the right environment to survive. But calcium's only one piece of that, and you may not need as much as you were thinking. So I hope this video is helpful. I hope it answered some questions. If you have some more thoughts about calcium, if you have some thoughts about other vitamins, exercise, check out my other videos. Leave a question in the comments. Happy to answer that. And if you like what you're seeing, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.